Vanakkam, Namaste, and blessings to everyone. This is Dr. Bhairavi Balasubramanian, PhD, the Sky Priestess. So, today we have a really important topic, namely the astrology that is behind the coronavirus pandemic. Now, to be honest, I'd actually written about this in a kind of a think piece, thought piece of mine, and it was already ready for publication, but something in me just told me to wait, and I did. I decided to just wait, see how it would turn out, and I think the wait was worth it because whatever I said in my paper actually came to pass, which is a great confirmation for me as an astrologer. But I'm just going to read out some of the stuff that I was writing. I think it must have been nearly a week ago, and it's kind of surprising to me as just how accurate it is, because if you think about it, astrology can be very frightening when you use it for these kinds of purposes. So let's first get into what we basically know. All right, we basically know. I mean, I'm just sticking to what is known. There's a lot that's unknown, obviously, but in terms of what we know, we are currently facing a pandemic, which spread all over the world, and governments are taking very powerful measures to make sure that people don't get as infected as they could be. This is like at the baseline statement. Now, there's actually a whole lot of astrology behind these events and actually give us information as to how we can best interpret all of this and how we can actually make sense of this. So I'm just going to read out, and I'll be riffing back and forth between what I've already typed out, what I've written so far, and what has already happened in the time that I initially wrote this, which was roughly a week ago. So the first case, I read this on the 13th of, I wrote this on the 13th of March actually. The first recorded case of COVID-19 infection is dated on the 17th of November 2019. This is according to media reportage on unpublished data held by the Chinese government. This was published in the Guardian newspaper on the 13th of March. On this day, we saw the supergalactic center at 1 degrees Libra opposing Chiron at 1 degrees Aries and squaring a body known as Pholus, Pholus, at 0 degrees Capricorn. I find Pholus's role in this outbreak to be the most significant player in understanding just what's going on. So we're going to talk about Pholus today. So it's interesting. I I knew about Pholus and I just kind of went, okay, let's look at the transit. And the transit indicated that Pholus entered Capricorn in November. And at that time, nobody knew that the first case was in November. So I just kind of went, nah, maybe I'm wrong about this. Let's look at it some other time. And on the day that I was guided to write that article, Pholus was, I believe, directly squaring the nodes in Capricorn and Cancer. Not squaring, directly conjuncting the south node in Capricorn and opposing the north node in Cancer. So, the way astrology works. So, into this body to try and understand what's going on. Most of you should be familiar with Chiron as a wounded healer. Chiron opposing the supergalactic center is already a big deal, and we'll talk about why later in the video. Chiron is referred to as the wounded healer in astrology and denotes experiences of wounding which, through transmutation and learning, can result in the generation of powerful medicine. In Aries, it connects to issues above the neck, face, head, etc., and a person's sense of selfhood. I can certainly say that globally, we're all feeling our sense of self really undergoes some very significant questioning. With all of these social distancing measures, I think it's a time where all of us are being forced to come back to ourselves, minus the filters of social media and so on and so forth. Mythologically speaking, Chiron is related to Pholus. Chiron and Pholus are both centaurs, and they both deal with Heracles the hero. Chiron was accidentally wounded by a poisoned arrow let loose by his student Heracles. Eventually, he trades his immortality to save the life of Prometheus, the immortal who was condemned to being chained to a rock with an eagle eating his ever regenerating liver for all of eternity. Prometheus was being punished for stealing fire from the gods and introducing it to mortals. So, by forsaking his immortality, Chiron is ultimately freed from the pain of the poison and then can die in peace, which is not the part of the wounded healer people generally talk about. So, literally, for Chiron to stop feeling wounded, Chiron has to die. And I'm not talking about the physical death in terms of 3D narratives. I'm talking about giving up the identity of woundedness itself so that one can actually move on from that particular archetype. And I've referred you in the past to the works of Carolyn Miss, especially in her book, Why People Don't Heal and How They Can, and the concept of woundology. It's very, very important to the mythology of Chiron and understanding how, as a mythological construct, there is escape from the pain, but by releasing that identity. Now, Chiron and Pholus, like I said, are related. Pholus is also a centaur from Greek mythology who also knows Heracles the hero. To show hospitality to the hero Heracles, Pholus opens a bottle of wine gifted to the centaurs by the drunken god of excess. Someone wants me to speak more slowly. That's not going to happen, honey. You can catch it in the review. Pholus opens a bottle of wine gifted to the centaurs by the drunken god of excess, Dionysus. The aroma of the wine drives the centaurs into a battle frenzy, whereupon they begin to attack Heracles. As Heracles pursues the centaurs with his flying poison arrows, it is here that one hits his healer teacher Chiron, causing his death. As Pholus the host examines an arrow from the body of a fallen centaur, the arrow falls on his leg and dies. So to repeat, Pholus basically is the host, as in Heracles is visiting his house. Pholus is saying, hey, come over, have some wine. He opens this wine that's been imbued by whatever, by the god of excess, Dionysus. And so when the wine, when he opens the wine and uncorks the wine, the aroma of the wine basically sends all of the centaurs into this, battle frenzy attack mode. And what happens is Heracles then has to defend himself. And I believe Heracles is probably affected by the wine itself because I was talking about this with my brother. Even though Heracles flees the cave and flees where he is to go and pursue the fleeing centaur, as he's fleeing, he manages to kill his teacher, Chiron. And if you think about it, Heracles is the great, great, great hero of Greek mythology. There's no way this guy would normally miss a target that badly. So there's a lot that can be read into this, but effectively, you see the web weaving Chiron, the teacher, who gets killed, Pholus, the host, who accidentally releases this noxious thing into the air that ends up in one way or another making Heracles both hero and inadvertent assassin of, two different centaurs in different times. Now, Pholus dies not by battle, not by disease, not by, getting hit by a wounded hero. He basically picks up this poison arrow and basically goes, oh, okay, this is interesting. What am I going to do with this? And he picks it up and he drops it on his leg. So Pholus is basically that bystander that has nothing better to do than to go and investigate and poke his nose in things that do not necessarily concern him directly. And so it is his own carelessness that kills him. So you can see, even in this myth, the way in which there is a clear allusion to the narrative of spreading germs, spreading disease, spreading viruses, but more importantly, spreading a sense of emotion or spreading a sense of psychic energy. So I was thinking about this. Is the wine that Pholus opens, is that wine the actual pathogen? Or is it the emotions that that wine evokes, which in this case was a frenzy of drunkenness, panic, and berserker like energy? And this was something else that my brother was pointing out to me. Dionysus is also very strongly related to the figure of Pan. Pan's energy is very much related to the energy of panic, among many other things. But apparently, the drums of Pan induce panic. And what is being associated with coronavirus right now, more so than the actual symptoms of the illness itself, it's the panic around it. So, for this reason, I basically thought, well, actually, rather than looking at, it's purely Chiron opposing the supergalactic center, we also need to be looking at Pholus as an agent of spreading not just the actual pathogen, but as the emotions and the heightened emotional responses around the spread of whatever is going through. So it's really a twofold thing. One is the actual symptoms, and the other is the emotionality, the berserker, the frenzy like energy that is associated with all of this. Like I said, I was already looking at Pholus as all of this was unfolding, but I just didn't have the starting date of all of this to go on. And don't worry if you don't catch it the first time I say it. What I tend to do is I speak and then I repeat it and I explain it in different ways so you are fine and you can always catch this on replay. So when we look at Greek mythology, apparently both Chiron and Pholus were immortalized in the stars. So these are really important narratives as part of Greek mythology. This isn't a small story. And there's so very much that can be read into this. I'm also going to be linking my article to this eventually, so you can maybe read a bit more of the nuanced interpretations there. But I wanted to introduce to you the dance between Chiron, Pholus, and Heracles. Now, Chiron and Pholus were already in very key positions during the official start, so to speak, the first known official case of this particular outbreak of COVID 19. So, the key lessons we need to take home from there is number one, there is a very large energetic push at this time to revisit our relationship with health and specifically how we understand our sense of self, being, our sense of just how do we interpret, how do we understand ourselves in a world that is less safe than we would like to imagine it to be. So as we allow ourselves to just experience that vulnerability that comes from being alive at this time, as we allow ourselves to acknowledge that we are not fully in control of our destinies, as New Age spirituality would like us to believe, when we give ourselves permission to experience, to be humble, to be vulnerable, to acknowledge that this is not in our control, then we have a breakthrough. And that is the energy that allows Chiron opposing the supergalactic center to be used in the most positive way possible. Unfortunately, with Pholus there, people are drumming up all the negatives. They're drumming up all of the, you're going to die, this is going to be an epidemic, Wall Street's going to crash. You know what? All of those things might still happen. And we will get to why later in this video. Like I said, there's a lot of information here. But going into panic mode is not going to serve anybody, it's not going to help anybody except negative forces that are waiting to feed off humanity for different reasons. Some are human, some are not. Now, if we look into, let me just scroll down and see what else we can talk about. I was looking at different transits to see how this has been historically manifest, because astrology really is about patterns. If it doesn't hold up to the pattern that existed in the past, then the interpretation is not valid. And when I looked at the positions of Chiron and Pholus and so on in previous cycles of disease, I found something very interesting. Now, prior activations, I looked at Chiron between 0 to 3 degrees Aries, basically. I found the first prior activation in the 20th century, July, actually, no, this is the second prior activation. They were actually, hang on, let me get the table. Here. The first one that I looked at was 1918. The second one in the same series was 1968, 1967, 1968. And the third was, of course, 2018, 2019, where we are now. What we see happening is kind of like a 50-year cycle, especially with respect to 1918, it was H1N1, the Spanish flu. 1968, 69, H3N2, the Hong Kong flu, and what's happening right now. These 50-year cycles occur essentially with Chiron roundabout where it was when this particular coronavirus outbreak happened. It's all happening at the tail end of Pisces, early Aries, as it opposes the supergalactic center. Basically, this is where you allow yourself to see how what's happening right now is effectively a very regular, frequent, in 50-year cycles, a very regular feature of how humanity deals with disease and viruses and how that creates immunity and death within the population. 50-year cycles. If this pattern is correct, the next time we should be seeing something like this would be in clockwork, round about 2068. So 1918, 1968, 2018 to 2019, and so on and so forth. There's about a 2 to 3 year window that occurs with these viruses, so it's about that time. Now, what I would say is that if we were to look at the severity, 1918, we had 500 million people infected on the planet, and that result, depending on who you ask, anywhere between 20 to 100 million deaths. It was rated as 5 out of 5 in terms of severity. In 1968, you had 0.25 to 1 billion people infected, but that basically resulted in 1 to 4 million deaths. The death rate was a lot lower. The severity was 2 out of 5. And what we're having right now, we obviously don't have the numbers in, but what we're seeing right now, as part of even longer term patterns of looking at viruses and how humanity has coped, we're going to be seeing a lot of infection. But the death rate, in all likelihood, is going to be far lower than what it has been in previous disease cycles, just because technology has evolved, medicine has evolved. People hopefully are listening to scientists on this. I'm not going to say that scientists understand spirituality and mysticism and the soul, but it does understand the spread of diseases because that is literally what it was designed to do. And this particular disease does have controversial origins. I was just reading about a patent of coronavirus that was already put a few years prior. And whilst this is not the same thing, it does indicate that it not only affects, but this was more focused on fowl, FOWL. It does indicate that that particular strain targeted not only the respiratory system, but also the reproductive system and the kidneys. So, if we were to see further mutations of the disease, it is likely to spread into these areas. And if we don't, great. But looking at the transits of Pholus and Capricorn, I can say that this energy is going to be going backwards and forwards over those initial degrees of Aries throughout of 2020 and into early 2021. So you are looking at least a year before everything calms down. That does not mean that you need to socially isolate for that entire year, hopefully. But what it means is that we really need to pay attention to what scientists are telling us right now to contain, to make sure that we're not going to have to be dealing with this for another 2 years. We need to contain what is happening right now. People are panicking because they don't remember previous iterations of this. The people who are alive in 1968, 69 can tell you what it was like then. And it's interesting that they are probably in one of the higher risk categories and groups. So, effectively, we need to understand that this is part of a cycle that happens as part of human existence on this planet in this particular series. Every time Chiron is at that start of Aries, end of Pisces, we see something like this happening. So don't give in to the, oh my God, this is now, humanity is ending, life on this planet is ending. No, it's just part of a very, very long cycle. A lot of us are just not old enough to remember. So that's what I wanted to say with Chiron. Now, when we look at Pholus's energy honestly is a lot more worrying. And when I say it's worrying, it's worrying. Um, if we think about it, Pholus is intoxicating liquor, alcohol, wine, whatever you want to call it, that drives people to their basest, well, expressions. I'm thinking of, for now, it's Australians hoarding toilet paper, but every country is going to manifest its particular version of crazy. Let's just put it that way. For some context, you can really see how Malaysia has handled it. Like I said, there's going to be more I'm going to be talking about in this video. We're only halfway through. But in the time since I wrote this, Malaysia has instituted a movement control order. So if you go out of your house for anything except to buy very essential supplies, you can pay up to a fine of about 2,000 US dollars. And if you and basically they're bringing in the army to comply with this because Malaysians don't want to be listening to this. They're like, no, life is going on as usual, but the government is like, no, you have to take this seriously. Of course, the number of cases spiked here because, shall we say, some deeply religious people decided that they needed to go and have a religious gathering at this time, and they're still having those gatherings in the tens of thousands all over Southeast Asia. So, yeah, if you ask them why, they say it's because they are more afraid of their God than they are of their disease. Well, I don't want to comment on the moral implications of that, but effectively, that's one of the reasons why Malaysia is in lockdown. So there's no real international travel allowed, coming in, going out, and people are basically just having to be here and manage. I've stocked up because we saw this coming. We've been really busy the past few days making sure that we have food and basic supplies because I can tell you, 5 hours after the announcement came, oil was already out, eggs were already out. So, people are slowly giving into that space. So the government has been trying the best to their ability to keep people on the same page. Like, we can beat this, we can fight this, we are in this together. I keep getting messages from the government, which I've never had before, about washing my hands, about messages from food delivery apps saying, no, no, we are still delivering. You can still get food, because for Malaysia, the fear is food. It's not loss of liberties, it's not loss of human rights, it's loss of food. This is Malaysia's soft point. So, anywhere, anytime this virus and the collective response to this hits a country's particular nerve, that's when you're really going to see the crazy coming out. It hasn't happened in Malaysia yet because people aren't taking it seriously enough. But I'm sure that that point has probably already been reached in Australia. It's probably reaching its way in the United States and other parts of the world. But getting back to Pholus and Capricorn, I looked at what happened with Pholus, historically speaking, and what I found was very, very, very interesting. The way I wrote this in my very, very long article was Pholus and Capricorn, intoxicants of power, conquest, empire, ideology, gold, opium, and fear. So, me being me, when I look at something and I get interested, I really, really, really look at it. Just historically speaking, I'm looking at larger transits of Pholus and Capricorn and what that meant for the collective. If you were going to be worried about something, this would be it. So, in the 17th century, these transits were between 1657 to 1851. These years paved the way for the entrenchment of colonial rule and the division of power that would influence the lives of all beings on the planet. The 1660s saw the restoration of the monarchy. By 1680, the cruelty that was the transatlantic slave trade has established itself as the primary source of labor for Virginian plantations. Essentially, and I'm just citing what I wrote here because there's a lot of material, the aroma of Pholus's wine in this era was the intoxicant of power acquired through brute force, the logic of early capitalism, and the sanction of empire. Textbooks present this period through rose-tinted glasses that cheer on the colonizing pioneers without looking at the human cost of the adventures. In the 18th century, 1747 to 1773, we saw the French and Indian War of the 1760s establishing Great Britain as the global hegemon through colonial conquest as part of the broader period of the Seven Years' War. In this time, the warring powers of Europe fought amongst themselves to establish dominion across 5 continents. And at the same time, the American Revolution was doing its best to try to hold British power in check and find its own path in the world. But on the one hand, empire was consolidating, and on the other hand, it was being limited by factions within what started off as the British Empire, calling themselves now as revolutionary powers, citing the values of freedom, liberty, and equality. And let it be understood that those concepts were selectively applied. In this period, the rhetoric, the wine, Pholus' wine here appears to be the rhetoric of freedom and revolution against the monarchical status quo. And we see that very strongly reflected in American history. In the 19th century, 1838 to 1863, this was when the Pholus's transit occurred. It started with Queen Victoria's rise to the throne in 1837, prompting a whole wave of imperialistic conquest and dominion across the globe, especially across the Ottoman Empire, Hong Kong, and India. And this is very interesting. In 1839 to 1842, you saw the first Opium War fought between the British and the Chinese as the British took over Hong Kong by force. The Chinese emperor did not want opium to be sold, another intoxicant, but the British basically said, no, we want it. So the British won a very, very decisive maritime victory over the Chinese to continue the lucrative opium trade. It doesn't get clearer than that. The madness, the intoxicant of Pholus, and how it relates to conquest and empire. And you keep seeing all of these pictures over and over and over again. This one is very sad for me to talk about. Between 1830 to 1850, so in this Pholus and Capricorn period, the Indian Removal Act enabled the forced dislocation of over 60,000 First Nations people from the southeastern United States, paving the way of European settlement of the Deep South. The most famous of this, or infamous of this, is the forced migration of the Cherokee people in 1838, precipitated by the discovery of gold in Georgia. Thousands of Cherokees perished through the way, along the way. along the way. 1848 to 1855, same period, different intoxicant, saw the California gold rush. A conservative estimate posits that no less than 9,492 indigenous people were killed between 1849 to 1870. And I'm quoting here, the U.S. occupied California in 1846. Government authorities and militias allowed and encouraged acts of enslavement, kidnapping, rape, child separation, and displacement. This was known as the Californian Genocide. The gold rush made life far worse for the indigenous populations who were forcibly displaced, enslaved, or who simply died from exposure to the colonizers' illnesses as the settlers needed land, and so on and so forth. This is a different version of the intoxicant. You can dig further, but it's the same pattern. In the 20th century, we saw this happening between 1928 to 1952. What happened here? 1929, you already had the Great Depression. I went back and checked. The market broke as Follis was at 0 degrees Capricorn. That's huge. It was attributed to panicky investors losing faith in the US economy and withdrawing their stocks en masse. What was also interesting about the Great Depression was that Chiron conjuncted the North Node in Taurus in the skies. Another hit of Chiron to the nodes. Exactly what's happening right now. See, what's also going on with Chiron, the supergalactic center, and Pholus is that they are all aspecting the North Node in Cancer and the South Node in Capricorn. So this is essentially an energy that's very, very similar to what happened in 1928, 1929, prompting the Great Depression, which created a worldwide depression, which created all kinds of economic issues. So, whilst this was ongoing, Pholus and Capricorn, authoritarian regimes in Europe and South America consolidated their powers in the 1930s. World War II breaks out during the same time period in 1939 and ends in 1945, involving the deaths of millions of people. And as it ends, and of course I'm heavily summarizing here, as it ends, it leads to the creation of new dividing lines, capitalism versus communism. And so this would be played out more so during the theater that was the Cold War. And in this time period, Pholus and Capricorn is essentially about what it was before: conquest, power, consolidation of control, and specifically economic power. Its intoxicant, yet again, is ideology, especially ideologies that promise economic or social security and in ways that still justify the enslavement, military deployment, and torture of others. Getting to the 21st century, we see the Pholus in Capricorn transit beginning in 2018 and ending in 2043. So the lessons that we learned here, we look at these initial acts, whether it's the gold, whether it's the discovery of gold, whether it's the realization that opium is lucrative business, whether it's the realization that going out and killing people in the name of empire is quite, intoxicating in its own way. Whether it's the idea that essentially you have to protect yourself by enslaving others throughout these periods, Polis has driven people to madness. It has driven nations to madness. And I would say coronavirus, whilst not necessarily going to be the agent of Polis through these decades, is certainly the thing that's kicking it off. So, given the review of Polis in prior years, we are likely to see, number one, major changes in the structure of global power. The way we deal with Pholus as a planet right now is going to determine what's going to be happening in this next, say, let me count this, 20 years afterwards. It's going, whatever we're going to be doing now in with this minute, at this moment, how we are allowing ourselves to respond to the challenges, to respond to what states and government, the limitations have put on us, this is really going to set the tone. Now, what actually, it's a 25-year period. So the first is major changes in the structure of global power. Number two, major ideological narratives that act as intoxicants, fueling attempts at control or intimidation or acting even as incitements to war. Three, major attempts at controlling the movement and freedoms of subject deemed as inferior, worthless, etc. Four, the designation of some substance, object, or resources as something worth fighting others over to control and get access to. This is essentially known as the divide and conquer tactic. So this is where, no matter how scary the world seems, you've got to understand that this is the real gameplay. Anyone with any insight, whether it's political, astrological, psychic, knows that there's something big coming. And what the governments of the world are doing right now during this coronavirus outbreak is going to be setting the stage, whether they know it or not at this point, for what's going to be coming in the years to come. So, what does that actually mean for the individual? We can't be going around defeating governments single handedly. First of all, you've got to pay attention to your immune system. If your physical immune system is unable to deal with the challenges that are happening, there is no point talking about anything else. You have got to focus on yourself because you cannot help anyone if you cannot help yourself. Secondly, look at your psychic immune system. And that also involves looking at the information you receive, whether it's part of social media, whether it's watching TV and looking at the news, because all of these pieces of information and the way they are spun have a very powerful influence on how you receive information and how you respond to the world. Which is why I think the social distancing thing is actually quite a brilliant idea. It gives you the ability for you to go back to yourself. Remember who you are. Remember that all of us are in this together. Every country on this planet is experiencing this challenge in its own way. And rather than seeing that as the opportunity to point to, well, that person's dirty, or that country is doing this, or this is the problem situation. If we bomb it, we'll all be safe. Without allowing ourselves to go into that divisive rhetoric, you need to look back at the larger picture. This is where governments that are unscrupulous, and I can't really name very many scrupulous governments, this is where people are going to be capitalizing on your fear. And you cannot afford to let that happen. Not just for you, but for whatever generations do come on this planet thereafter. So, again, pay attention to your immune system. Pay attention to your psychic and spiritual immune system. Pay attention to the information that you let in. In the name of being connected, we just tend to flood ourselves with what everybody else is watching. And remember, you don't need the internet to have a psychic connection with the rest of the planet. That existed before the technology existed to even give yourselves that illusion. Your relationship with spirit needs to come first, and that will require introspection, groundedness, and discernment. Otherwise, you're going to be losing your heads. Now, if people do not respect the fact that we are all being asked to withdraw at this time, and if they decide that they are going to be great heroes and continue to spread the virus, which is not really heroic, but if you think about Heracles and the myth, you can see where that comes from. Um, you got to understand that the astrology tells us that this can last anywhere between 1 to 3 years. 1 to 2 being the most likely, 1 to 3 at a pin, at a little, giving it a little bit of leeway. But it is going to extend if we do not take things seriously. So whilst I am usually not a pro government, pro whatever type spokesperson, I believe that in terms of what is the word? In terms of the study of diseases and their outbreaks, this is the most important message. That and wash your hands. Take care. Very many blessings. I'm probably going to go and tweak my article a little bit before I put it up on my website. And yeah, take care of yourselves. Do not give in to the fear. That does not do anything for anybody except Pholus and his wine. Cha cha for now. Bye bye.